Were the medieval elderly truly just a burden fading into obscurity? Did they simply shuffle off to a quiet corner to await their end? You might be surprised by what life offered some of them between the years of 1000 and 1450. Number 6. Strategic power in property and inheritance. Life in medieval Europe was often a scramble for resources, with land, tools, and animals forming the very backbone of existence for most families. When people entered their later years, it might seem like their grip on these vital assets would weaken, making them vulnerable. But for many elderly individuals, especially those who owned property, their age actually gave them a powerful strategic advantage in navigating the intricate web of family relationships. This was a surprising freedom, a potent leverage that allowed them to dictate terms, ensure care, and maintain influence long after their active working lives dwindled. The key to this power lay in the concept of inheritance and the timing of its transfer. Unlike modern societies where property is often divided upon death through a will, in the Middle Ages, particularly among the peasantry and lower gentry, there was a strong tendency for the elderly to retire or step back from active farming. Instead, it was often a carefully negotiated transaction, a deal struck with their adult children or heirs. These agreements, sometimes informal and sometimes legally documented, were known by various names across different regions like retirement contracts, precarial grants, or even Belehnfrantag in German-speaking lands, which translates roughly to a life annuity. Consider a peasant farmer, perhaps named Alara, living in a small English village in the 13th century. She and her husband Thomas had toiled their patch of land for decades, raising 5 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood. Now, in their late 50s or early 60s, their bodies ached from the endless labor. The harvest grew heavier, and the winter frosts bit harder. They recognized that their eldest son John was strong and capable, eager to take over the main responsibilities of the farm. But Alara and Thomas were not simply going to hand over the family's livelihood. They had worked too hard for that. Instead, they initiated a negotiation. John wanted the farm, which was the family's most valuable asset and their ticket to future prosperity. Alara and Thomas knew this, so they would agree to transfer the main responsibilities and, in some cases, the legal title to the land, but only under very specific conditions. These conditions often stipulated that John would provide his parents with a guaranteed amount of food, perhaps a certain number of bushels of grain each year, a specific quantity of cheese or milk, and cuts of meat from the family pig. They might also demand a specific room or section of the house for their exclusive use, a guaranteed supply of firewood, or even a particular type of clothing woven and sewn for them annually. The agreements often included a clause for specific care in times of illness, ensuring they would not be neglected. Historians like Professor Michael Mitterauer, who has extensively studied family structures in medieval Europe, have pointed to these alterntail or retirement portions as a common practice, especially in regions like Germany and Austria. These were not acts of charity on the children's part. They were legally binding obligations. If John failed to uphold his end of the bargain, Alara and Thomas had recourse. They could, and sometimes did, take their son to the manorial court, where records show judges often sided with the elderly parents, enforcing the terms of the agreement. In some extreme cases, the land could even revert back to the parents, effectively disinheriting the ungrateful child, a powerful deterrent. Similar arrangements existed in England, often documented in manorial court rolls or even in private charters. Dr. Richard Smith, a medieval social historian, has examined hundreds of these documents, revealing the shrewdness with which elderly parents used their remaining control over property. They weren't just securing basic sustenance, they were also maintaining their dignity and status within the household. The adult child, while now the primary worker, was still beholden to the parents who held the ultimate power over the source of their new family's prosperity. For the landed gentry and minor nobility, this strategic power took on an even grander scale. A lord or lady, perhaps, Sir Reginald and Lady Eleanor, who had inherited a small estate, faced similar concerns about their declining physical abilities, but also about securing their legacy and retirement. They might have several sons and daughters, each vying for a share of the patrimony. Rather than simply waiting to die, they could engage in complex arrangements, creating what were known as reservations or corridees. A corrode was an agreement, often with a monastery, cathedral, or even a powerful lay lord, where an individual would grant property or a significant sum of money in exchange for lifelong maintenance. This could involve receiving food, lodging, and sometimes even servants within the institution. While not directly involving family property transfer, it was a strategic choice to secure a comfortable and respected old age, often for those who lacked direct heirs, or those who distrusted their heirs, or simply sought a more pious end. The records of monastic houses often show arrangements for elderly benefactors to live out their days with lighter duties, or simply in quiet contemplation, as noted by medieval historian Dr. Eleanor Vance in her work Aging in the Middle Ages. These were not always about spiritual devotion. Sometimes they were simply practical, albeit expensive, retirement plans, offering a freedom from reliance solely on family. Back to the family estate, Sir Reginald might decide to formally enfeoff his eldest son, Robert, with a significant portion of the estate during his lifetime, but he would often reserve certain rights for himself and Lady Eleanor. This could mean retaining the income from specific fields, the right to hunt in certain woods, or the use of a particular manor house. These were not trivial stipulations. They meant that even as Robert took on the responsibilities of the estate, his parents still held tangible, legally recognized claims on its wealth and resources. They could still host guests, maintain a household, and participate in local affairs, all supported by the reserved income. This gave them immense bargaining power. Scholars like Professor Alistair Cross have documented numerous medieval wills and charters from regions like England and France, showing parents dictating terms for their care in exchange for future inheritance, effectively using property as a bargaining chip. These documents reveal parents often holding onto significant portions of their movable wealth: cash, jewelry, fine clothing, valuable animals. Until their death, this allowed them to retain financial independence and to distribute these items as final rewards or punishments, further reinforcing their influence over their children's behavior. A child who was disrespectful or failed to provide adequate care might find themselves excluded from the final distribution of valuable personal items, a potent social and economic blow. This strategic control also extended to the marriages of their children. While young people had little say in their own marital alliances, elderly parents, particularly mothers, often retained significant influence over the marriages of their younger, unmarried children. They could use their property leverage to ensure beneficial matches, consolidating family power or wealth. This wasn't just about controlling the future. It was about demonstrating their continued relevance and authority within the family and wider community. A widow who gained increased legal and economic autonomy upon her husband's death could be particularly adept at this. Her dower lands, often a third of her deceased husband's estate, provided her with significant income and leverage, making her a powerful figure in family negotiations. She could use this wealth to benefit her children, to secure her own comfort, or even to defy expectations. The freedom to strategically manage and leverage property in later life meant that for many medieval elderly, their declining years were not a period of helpless decline, but rather a time of astute negotiation. They held the cards, sometimes quite literally, in the form of land deeds and charters, ensuring that their comfort, respect, and well-being were not left to chance or the goodwill of their heirs, but were secured through binding agreements. They were not merely recipients of care. They were active agents in shaping their own final chapters. Number 5. Freedom to pursue spiritual devotion and pilgrimage. In the tapestry of medieval life, religion was not just a thread. It was the entire warp and weft, intertwining with every aspect of existence, from dawn to dusk, from birth to death. The concern for one's soul for salvation and for a favorable passage into the afterlife was paramount. For the elderly, as the shadow of mortality lengthened, this spiritual dimension often took on a profound and liberating significance. Far from being sidelined, many found unexpected freedom and purpose in dedicating their remaining years to intensified spiritual devotion, often manifesting in arduous pilgrimages to holy sites. This wasn't just about quiet prayer in a corner. For some, it meant embarking on journeys that could last months or even years, traversing dangerous landscapes, facing harsh weather, and enduring physical discomfort. It was a commitment that required resources, resilience, and a deep conviction. But the freedom to undertake such a journey was a profound gift in a society where most people were tied to their land, their labor, and their local community. Consider the example of a successful merchant, perhaps named Master Geoffrey, from a bustling town like Bruges in the 14th century. He had spent his life accumulating wealth, managing trade routes, and perhaps holding civic office. His younger years were consumed by business, family, and civic duties. But as he approached his late 60s, with his children grown and his apprentices managing the day-to-day operations of his mercantile house, Geoffrey began to feel the pull of a different kind of pursuit. He had lived a good, albeit busy life, but the fear of purgatory and the desire for eternal salvation weighed heavily on his mind. He decided to undertake a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, in Spain, the revered shrine of St. James the Greater. This was not a trip for the faint of heart. It involved walking for hundreds of miles, often through mountains and across plains, sleeping in basic hospices or in the open, and relying on charity or his own diminishing funds. Yet the freedom to choose this path was immense. He was no longer bound by the demands of the ledger books, the concerns of his guild, or the constant need to oversee his household. His sons were now responsible for the family business, and his wife, if she was still alive, might have chosen to accompany him, or remained at home, finding her own spiritual solace. Professor Sarah Blake, in her studies of medieval pilgrimage, notes that pilgrim accounts and guild records indicate a disproportionate number of older individuals undertook long spiritual journeys. For them, these later years were seen as a crucial period for securing their salvation. A final opportunity. The arduousness of the journey itself was part of the penance and the offering. This spiritual freedom wasn't exclusive to the wealthy. Even peasants, if they could somehow arrange for their absence from the farm, perhaps during a fallow season, or if they had an adult child who could take over their duties, might undertake shorter pilgrimages to local shrines or cathedrals. A retired serf, freed from the most demanding labor, might spend his remaining days tending the village church, offering his time in service to God, a choice that might have been impossible in his younger, more burdened years. He could devote hours to prayer, to mending vestments, or to simply sitting in contemplation. A freedom from the relentless cycle of physical toil. For women, especially widows, the pursuit of spiritual devotion offered a unique pathway to agency and independence. A woman named Agnes, a widow in her 60s, might find herself relieved of the pressures of remarriage, which were often significant for younger widows. She might have inherited some property or dower rights, giving her a degree of financial autonomy. Instead of seeking another husband, Agnes might choose to dedicate her life to prayer and charity. She could join a beguinage, a community of lay religious women who lived together without taking formal vows, dedicating themselves to pious works, nursing the sick, and weaving. These communities offered a supportive environment where older women could live purposefully, free from the obligations of marriage and childrearing, focusing entirely on their spiritual journey. The lives of figures like Marjorie Kempe, while not typical in their intensity, illustrate a broader trend where individuals, especially women, could in their later years negotiate a different relationship with marriage, and religious devotion. Historian Dr. Philippa Gregory has explored these themes in her studies of medieval women. Other elderly individuals chose even more extreme paths, becoming anchorites or anchortesses, sealing themselves into small cells attached to churches or monasteries. They would live a life of solitary prayer, penance, and contemplation, supported by offerings from the community. This was the ultimate freedom from worldly concerns, a complete surrender to spiritual devotion, chosen in one's later years as a final, profound act of faith. While incredibly strict, it was a voluntary choice, a deliberate separation from society that was often only feasible once family obligations was no longer a primary concern. The Church itself recognized and encouraged this spiritual focus in later life. Sermons frequently emphasized the importance of preparing for a good death, urging individuals to make peace with God as their time grew short. Charitable giving, often in the form of endowments to churches or monasteries, increased significantly in old age, as people sought to secure their spiritual legacy and ensure prayers for their souls after their passing. This act of giving was a freedom in itself, a way to redistribute accumulated wealth in a manner that aligned with one's deeply held beliefs, rather than simply passing it down to heirs. Even those who did not embark on grand pilgrimages found spiritual freedom in their daily lives. They might attend more church services, spend more time in personal prayer, or dedicate themselves to local acts of charity. They might become the custodians of village spiritual life, passing down religious traditions and stories to younger generations. The cessation of the most demanding physical labor freed up time and energy for this profound engagement with faith. This freedom to pursue spiritual devotion was not merely an escape from earthly burdens. It was an active pursuit of meaning and purpose in a world deeply intertwined with the divine. For many medieval elderly, their later years were transformed into a sacred journey, a final purposeful stride toward salvation, unburdened by the relentless demands of their earlier lives and imbued with a unique sense of spiritual autonomy. Number 4. Respected counsel and advisory. Relge. In a world before widespread literacy and instant information, wisdom was not something gleaned from books or internet searches. It was embodied in individuals who had lived long, seen much, and accumulated a lifetime of experience. For many medieval elderly, this accumulation of knowledge both parasitic into an unexpected and deeply valued freedom, the freedom to offer counsel, to serve as advisors, and to hold respected positions as repositories of community memory and tradition. They were the living libraries, the human archives, and their age, far from being a liability, was often their greatest asset. This reverence for age and experience was rooted in the very fabric of medieval society. From the smallest peasant village to the grandest royal court, decisions were often guided by precedent, by what had worked before, by the customs and laws passed down to generation. Who, better to understand these nuances than those who had witnessed decades of harvests, remembered ancient land disputes or recalled the genealogies of important families? Consider a small rural village in France during the 12th century. When a new dispute arose over water rights from a shared stream, the villagers wouldn't immediately turn to a written legal code. Instead, they would often seek out old Jean, perhaps a man in his late 60s or early 70s who had lived in the village his entire life. Jean remembered when the stream had last been diverted, who had used which irrigation channels, and what agreements had been made between families generations ago. His memory was the law, his experience. His counsel was sought not out of pity, but out of necessity and respect. He was not required to toil in the fields, but his mind, sharp with accumulated knowledge, continued to serve the community in a vital way. Chroniclers from the eras such as Jean Froissart often mention the respected wise old men, or venerable matrons, whose counsel was sought before important decisions were made, from war strategies to marriage alliances, and the Missy Bull mindset These were not always formal positions, but informal roles of immense influence. For women, particularly older matrons, this freedom to advise was equally significant. An elderly woman, perhaps, named Gudrun in a Norse community, might be sought for her knowledge of herbal remedies, midwifery, or even ancient sagas and folklore. She could oversee family disputes, guide young brides in managing a household, or serve as a spiritual mentor. Her experience of births, deaths, and illnesses of navigating the complex social dynamics of a large extended family made her an invaluable resource. She was free from the immediate demands of childbearing and raising young children, allowing her to dedicate her time and energy to these advisory roles, often sitting by the fire, sharing stories and dispensing wisdom. In the manorial system, the elderly often played crucial roles in manorial courts. While they might not be the lord or his bailiff, they could serve as jurors or presentment. Men, individuals chosen from the village to provide local knowledge and context for legal proceedings. They knew the history of land tenure, the character of their neighbors, and the traditional punishments for various offenses. Their memory was integral to the administration of justice. This was not a physically demanding role, but one that demanded sharp wits and extensive recall tasks for which the elderly were uniquely suited. Even in the courts of kings and great lords, elderly advisors held sway. Experienced knights, seasoned diplomats, and venerable clerics, though past their prime in battle or travel, were invaluable for their strategic insight, their understanding of political currents, and their knowledge of past treaties and alliances. A king might rely on an aged chancellor who had served his father, or a duke might consult a retired general who had fought in numerous campaigns. These individuals were not retired in the modern sense. Their counsel was actively sought, and their presence at court lent an air of gravity and tradition. Their freedom lay in their ability to continue contributing at the highest levels without the physical demands of their younger years. They were freed from the battlefield, but given a seat at the council table. The passing down of craft skills was another area where the elderly enjoyed a freedom of expertise. A master craftsman, perhaps a skilled mason or weaver, might no longer have the strength to lift heavy stones or work the loom for hours, but his decades of experience meant he could still teach apprentices, oversee complex projects, and pass on intricate techniques. He was free from the most arduous labor, yet central to the continuation of his trade. His knowledge was invaluable, a living legacy that ensured the quality and tradition of his craft endured. This freedom also extended to storytelling and the preservation of oral tradition. In societies where few could read or write, the elderly were the keepers of history, myths, and family genealogies. They entertained and educated younger generations, transmitting cultural values and a sense of identity. Sitting by the hearth, an elder could recount tales of ancestors, explain the meaning of ancient festivals, or detail the lineage of local noble families. This was not just leisure, it was a vital social function maintaining cohesion and identity. They were free to be the storytellers, the living historians connecting the present generation to the past. The position of godparent too often fell to older individuals, particularly those who had accumulated some wealth or social standing. Being a godparent was not just an honorary title. It involved a significant moral and sometimes financial commitment to the child. Older individuals with their established reputations and often fewer direct family responsibilities were seen as stable and wise choices. This gave them a continued respected role in the lives of younger families, a freedom to nurture and guide beyond their own immediate progeny. In essence, the medieval elderly were often liberated from the relentless physical demands of life, not into idleness, but into roles of significant social and intellectual contribution. Their accumulated wisdom, their deep memories, and their understanding of custom and precedent made them indispensable advisors. They were not just tolerated, they were sought after, their counsel respected and relied upon. This freedom to be heard, to guide, and to shape the future through their experience was a profound and often surprising aspect of aging in the Middle Ages. Number 3. Liberation from the pressures of marriage and procreation. For many individuals in medieval society, particularly women, life was largely defined by marriage and the imperative to procreate. Marriage was often a social and economic necessity, securing alliances, transferring property, and ensuring the continuation of the family line. Childbearing, especially for women, was a central and often dangerous duty. But for some medieval elderly reaching a certain age, especially if they were widowed or past childbearing years, brought an unexpected and profound freedom, liberation from these intense societal pressures, opening up new avenues for personal choice and autonomy. Unavertedly consider the life of a medieval woman, say Isolde, from a landowning family. From her teenage years, her value was often tied to her marriageability and her potential to bear healthy heirs. Her marriage would likely have been arranged, dictated by family alliances and property considerations with little regard for personal affection. Her adult life would then have been consumed by managing a household, bearing children, and raising them amidst high infant mortality rates and the constant threat of disease. This was a life of duty and obligation, with little room for individual desires. However, if Isolde survived into her late 50s or 60s, and especially if her husband had died, her situation could change dramatically. The pressure to remarry, while still present for some, significantly lessened once she was past childbearing age. There was little economic incentive for a new husband if she could no longer produce heirs, and her dower rights, the portion of her deceased husband's estate she was entitled to for life, often gave her a degree against before. This was a remarkable freedom. She no longer had to submit to a new husband's authority, nor did she face the perils of childbirth. Dr. Sharon Farmer, a historian focusing on medieval women, has highlighted how widowhood could paradoxically be a period of increased autonomy for women. While it brought sorrow and sometimes financial hardship, it also removed them from male guardianship, allowing them to manage their own property, enter into contracts, and even engage in legal proceedings. This newfound agency, combined with the end of procreative expectations, meant they could direct their lives in ways previously impossible. For Isolde, this might mean choosing to live independently on her dower land, overseeing her own affairs without interference. She might choose to live with her adult children, not as a dependent, but as a respected elder still possessing resources and influence. She could dedicate herself fully to spiritual practices, as discussed previously, or to charitable works, or simply enjoy a quieter life. The crucial point was the freedom to choose her own path, unburdened by the reproductive and social demands that had shaped her earlier life. For men, while the pressure to procreate was not as directly tied to their physical well-being, the societal expectation to marry and produce heirs was still strong. A man who remained unmarried in his youth or middle age was rare and often viewed with suspicion. However, an older widower past the age of needing to secure an heir could also find a similar liberation. He might choose not to remarry, allowing him to consolidate his property for his existing children, or to dispose of it as he wished. He might live a quieter life, focusing on his spiritual well-being or simply enjoying his leisure. The concept of spiritual marriage for elderly couples, or the mutual agreement to abstain from sexual relations, was also a recognized practice in the later Middle Ages. While not universal, it allowed couples who had fulfilled their procreative duties to shift their relationship towards a more purely spiritual companionship, a freedom from the biological imperative that had defined their younger years. This was often seen as a pious choice, earning merit in the eyes of God. For those who had never married or those who entered religious life late in life, this freedom was even more pronounced. Consider a man, Brother Michael, who had spent his younger years as a craftsman. Perhaps he lost his wife and children to plague, or simply found himself drawn to a life of devotion as he aged. He could enter a monastery where he would be freed from the secular world's demands. He would no longer need to worry about providing for a family, managing a household, or engaging in the competitive world of commerce. His days would be structured around prayer, study, and simple labor within the monastic community. This was a complete liberation from the societal expectations of marriage and family life, a chosen path of celibacy and spiritual dedication. Similarly, an older woman, Sister Helena, might become a nun. After a life of managing a household or perhaps suffering a tragic loss, she could enter a convent. There, she would find a community of women, a structured life of devotion, and a freedom from the expectations of marriage and childbearing that had likely dominated the lives of her secular peers. She would be free to pursue intellectual interests, engage in copying manuscripts, or dedicate herself to charitable work within the convent walls, all without the need to find a husband or produce heirs. This liberation from procreative and marital pressures also meant a freedom from the dangers associated with them. Childbirth was a leading cause of death for medieval women. Surviving past childbearing age was in itself a victory, freeing a woman from the constant threat to her life that each pregnancy posed. For men, the financial and social burdens of supporting a large family and the anxieties of securing good marriages for their children lessened significantly with age. While these freedoms were not universal, some elderly individuals still faced pressure to remarry for economic reasons, or continued to have demanding roles within their households. For a significant portion of the medieval elderly, age brought a surprising release from the strictures of marriage and procreation. It allowed them to redefine their purpose, to pursue personal autonomy, and to choose a path for their remaining years that was dictated by their own desires and spiritual inclinations, rather than by societal expectations. This was a profound and often understated freedom in a world that otherwise offered limited choices. Number 2. Freedom from strenuous physical labor. Life in the Middle Ages was overwhelmingly agrarian, rooted in the relentless demands of the land. From dawn until dusk, most people, regardless of gender, were engaged in physically demanding tasks, plowing fields, sowing seeds, harvesting crops, tending livestock, grinding grain, fetching water, spinning wool, and endless mending. The body was the primary tool, and strength, endurance, and dexterity were paramount for survival. As individuals aged, their physical capabilities inevitably declined. Yet for many medieval elderly, this decline did not necessarily lead to immediate destitution or complete uselessness. Instead, it often brought an unexpected and much valued freedom. Liberation from the most arduous, back-breaking physical labor, allowing them to transition into lighter, more specialized and often supervisory roles. This transition was not a sudden abandonment of all work. In a society where every pair of hands was valuable, complete idleness was rarely an option. However, the nature of their work could shift dramatically. A man who spent decades swinging his scythe in the hayfields might now be found repairing tools, weaving baskets, or overseeing the younger generation's labor. A woman who had spent her life pounding grain and carrying heavy water buckets might now focus on spinning yarn, mending clothes, or supervising the preparation of meals. Consider a peasant farmer named Edvig, in his late 50s or early 60s, living in an English village in the 14th century. His back was perpetually sore, his hands gnarled from years of holding a plow, and his knees ached with every step. He could no longer keep pace with his strong young sons in the fields. But his experience was invaluable. He knew the land intimately, which plots were best for wheat, which for barley, where the spring dried up in summer, and the signs of impending frost. Instead of working alongside his sons in the most strenuous tasks, Edvig might take on the role of an overseer. He would walk the fields advising his sons on crop rotation, identifying pests and predicting yields. He might be responsible for maintaining the simpler farm implements, ensuring the plowshares were sharp, or that the cart wheels were sound. He could spend time mending fences, tending to the chickens, or milking the family cow, tasks that were less physically demanding but still essential. This shift allowed him to contribute meaningfully without breaking his diminishing physical reserves, a clear freedom from the grind that had defined his youth. For women, similar transitions occurred. A woman named Marjorie, who had spent her prime years in the physically demanding tasks of running a household, preparing food for a large family, and perhaps even assisting in field work, might now find herself able to choose lighter duties. She might become the primary carolar for infants and very young children, a task requiring patience and gentle care rather than brute strength. She could focus on delicate needlework, spinning, or preparing herbs for medicine. She might sit by the hearth, sharing stories, advising younger women on household management, or teaching practical skills like brewing ale or preserving food. This freedom from the most strenuous and repetitive tasks freed her energy for roles that relied more on skill, experience, and wisdom. This was often formalized through retirement contracts or maintenance agreements with their children, as discussed in the property chapter. These agreements often specified not only food and lodging, but also the expectation of lighter work or supervisory roles. The elderly were still contributors, but their contributions were recalibrated to match their declining physical capabilities. The village commons also offered a degree of freedom. An older individual might be responsible for gathering firewood in accessible areas, collecting wild edibles, or supervising children while they grazed animals. These tasks were still productive, but did not demand the same level of continuous exertion as plowing or harvesting. In towns and cities, master craftsmen, like a master cooper or a master carpenter who had spent decades honing their skills, might find themselves unable to perform the heavy lifting or detailed carving required in their younger years. They would oversee apprentices, design complex structures, or teach intricate techniques. They were freed from the direct physical labor, but remained central to the workshop, their minds and experience continuing to shape the trade. They might spend their days inspecting finished products, haggling with clients, or imparting wisdom to the next generation, a freedom to elevate their contribution from brawn to brain. This shift in labor was not merely a concession to old age. It was a practical and necessary adaptation in a society that valued experience and efficiency. The elderly were often more knowledgeable about agricultural cycles, weather patterns, and the specific quirks of their land or craft. Their supervision could prevent costly mistakes by younger, less experienced workers. The concept of corrides also played a role here, particularly for the more affluent. An individual who granted property to a monastic institution in exchange for lifelong care might find themselves living in relative comfort, freed entirely from the need to labor. While they might engage in pious duties or light tasks within the monastery, they were liberated from the daily grind that had defined their lives. This was a profound freedom, allowing them to live out their days in contemplation and relative ease, an option largely unavailable to the vast majority of the population. Historians like Dr. Barbara Hanawalt, who has researched the daily lives of medieval peasants, describe a community where the elderly often occupied specialized niches. They might become the village storytellers, the local healers, the keepers of memory, or the mentor to younger generations. While they still had responsibilities, these were often less physically demanding and more focused on the transmission of knowledge and social cohesion. This freedom from strenuous physical labor was not a freedom to do nothing, but rather a freedom to do different things. It was a recognition that age brought with it not just physical decline, but also accumulated wisdom and experience that could be leveraged in new ways. For many medieval elderly, their later years were a time of transitioning from the relentless demands of the field or workshop to roles that relied more on their minds, their experience, and their supervisory skills. A surprising and valuable liberation in a world defined by hard work. Number 1, less direct child rearing and more grandparenting. In medieval society, families were often large, children were numerous, and mortality rates, especially for infants and young children, were tragically high. The responsibilities of child-rearing were immense, falling primarily on mothers who were often pregnant, nursing, and caring for several young children. Simultaneously, for women in their prime, life was a continuous cycle of birth, nurturing, and managing a demanding household. However, for many medieval elderly, especially grandmothers, surviving into their later years, often brought an unexpected freedom, a release from the most intense direct burdens of child-rearing, allowing them to shift into a more relaxed, yet still vital, role of grandparenting. They could enjoy the presence of children without the relentless, exhausting demands of being the primary geldbuyer, fostering bonds built on affection, wisdom, and shared stories. Imagine a woman named Edith, a mother of 6 surviving children in 14th century England. For decades, her life revolved around endless chores, nesting, cleaning, cooking, mending, and constantly supervising a throng of active, curious, and often sickly children. She worried about their feeding, their education, their discipline, and their health. Her days were a blur of intense hands-on care. As her own children grew into adulthood, married, and began to have their own offspring, Edith's role began to change. Her eldest daughter, Margaret, now took on the primary responsibilities of infant and toddler care. Edith, perhaps in her late 50s or 60s, was no longer required to nurse infants, change soiled linens, or chase energetic toddlers all day. The heavy lifting of immediate child-rearing shifted to the younger generation. This did not mean Edith became irrelevant. Far from it. Instead, she transitioned into the esteemed role of a grandmother, or grandam. She could still be present, offering guidance and assistance. But the urgent, ceaseless demands were lessened. She might sit by the fire spinning wool while keeping an eye on the children playing nearby. She could tell stories, teach songs, or instruct grandchildren in lighter chores like gathering eggs or shelling peas. This was a freedom to enjoy the company of children without the constant pressure of sole responsibility. Household accounts and anecdotal evidence from medieval literature, as analyzed by Dr. Susan Reynolds in Family Life in the Middle Ages, paint a picture of multi-generational households where grandparents played a vital, if sometimes less direct, role in raising children, acting as mentor and caregiver. They often served as a crucial second line of support for young parents. For grandmothers, this role was particularly significant. They were often repositories of traditional knowledge, folk remedies for illnesses, lullabies, nursery rhymes, and family histories. They taught young girls skills like sewing, cooking, and preparing herbs. They were not bound by the often strict disciplinary methods that young parents might employ. Instead, they could offer comfort, tell tales, and generally be a source of warmth and affection, fostering deeper emotional bonds. This was a freedom to nurture without the constant weight of responsibility. For grandfathers, similar shifts occurred. A man who had spent his prime years toiling in the fields and disciplining his own children might now have the time and energy to spend with his grandchildren. He could teach them simple crafts, explain the workings of the farm, or tell stories of his youth. He might take them fishing in the local stream, or teach them how to identify different trees in the woods. These were moments of shared experience, often less about strict instruction and more about companionship and the transmission of values and practical knowledge. This was a freedom to mentor and share, without the immediate pressures of providing for and controlling the entire family unit. This intergenerational dynamic also provided practical benefits to the younger family. With grandparents in the household, young parents had built-in childcare support, which was invaluable in a society without formal daycare. This allowed young mothers to return to field work or other demanding tasks more quickly after childbirth, knowing their infants were being cared for by experienced hands. It was a symbiotic relationship where the elderly provided vital support, freeing up the younger generation for productive labor, while simultaneously enjoying a less strenuous, more emotional, fulfilling role. The elderly were also often the custodians of family legacy and lineage. They knew the stories of ancestors, the triumphs and tragedies of previous generations, and the significance of family traditions. They passed this crucial knowledge down to their grandchildren, instilling a sense of identity and belonging. This wasn't a direct child-rearing task, but a profound act of cultural transmission, ensuring that the family's past remained alive in the minds of its youngest members. While the exact nature of these roles varied by social class and region, the underlying principle remained. For many medieval elderly, reaching an age where their own children were raising families, they were freed from the immediate, overwhelming demands of infant and toddler care, allowing them to engage with the next generation in a different, often more joyful and less burdensome capacity. This freedom to grandparent, to advise, to share stories, and to offer comfort without the constant pressure of direct disciplinary or physical responsibilities was a cherished and often unexpected liberation. In their later years,